and people are looking for. A revolution is the way to describe it, because it's a fundamental change to the way people want to work and companies want to support their workers. And it's a permanent change, and it will be one of the lasting legacies of the pandemic.
I'm Paulo Sandoval in Bogota, Colombia, and this is CNN.
Hello everyone and welcome to Amanpour. Here's what's coming up.
He wants less NATO. President Putin is getting more NATO by Finland and Sweden joining our alliance.
NATO enlarges as Turkey lifts its veto. The Swedish Prime Minister joins our program. Then
we try to give Russia an opportunity, and to Putin especially an opportunity, and perhaps over the years we've been a bit naive.
my conversation with the host of the Madrid summit, the Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez, on how committed NATO is to making sure Putin does not win in Ukraine. Also ahead,
the president said something to the effect of, "I'm the effing president, take me up to the Capitol now."
jaw-dropping testimony as the January 6th hearings continue. We have all the details in a special report, plus
so many of our leading politicians knew exactly that this was a lie and went ahead with this attempt to overthrow U.S. democracy.
the importance and implications of these hearings with Yale professor and fascism expert Jason Stanley. His frank discussion with Hari Srinivasan. Welcome to the program, everyone. I'm Christiane Amanpour in London. NATO leaders are gathered in Madrid, Spain, for the most consequential meeting in the organization's history. The summit kicked off by enlarging the alliance, giving Putin more NATO, not less. President Biden saying that Finland and Sweden's accession would show a major miscalculation by the Russian leader.
Putin was looking for the Finlandization of Europe. We're going to get the NATOization of Europe. And that's exactly what he didn't want, but exactly what needs to be done to guarantee security for Europe. And I think it's necessary, and I'm looking forward to it happening formally.
And you can see in this map just how long a border Finland shares with Russia. When Sweden and Finland become NATO member states, it'll lengthen Russia's border with the alliance by some 800 miles. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says this move proves that Putin is failing, at least on this front.
The decision to invite Finland and Sweden to become members demonstrates that NATO's door is open. It demonstrates that President Putin did not succeed in closing NATO's door. NATO's door remains open.
But danger does remain as Russian forces continue to dominate in eastern Ukraine. I discussed all of this and more with the Swedish Prime Minister, Magdalena Andersson. Prime Minister Magdalena Andersson, thank you for joining us from Madrid. Can I first ask you about the historic nature of you now being back on the fast track? You will be a NATO member. What do you think this says to Putin, and what can you bring to the alliance?
Well, definitely this is a historic day for both Sweden and for Finland. And for Sweden, becoming a NATO member would actually mean that we leave 200 years of military non-alignment. So this was not an easy decision to take for me as Prime Minister, but I'm sure it was the right decision, and it has an overwhelming support in the Swedish Parliament. What we want to do, of course, this is something would make Sweden a safer country and safer for Swedish citizens, but we want to be a security provider in NATO and contribute to the security of all NATO countries and all citizens in the NATO countries.
Prime Minister, you know, the many members of the Baltic states, which feel almost the most vulnerable right now, at least that's what they say, said that, you know, up until now, there was really no plan for NATO to actually defend them if there was to be a rapid strike by Putin. But now your accession specifically protects the Baltics a little more. Is that correct?
Definitely so. Now, I mean, states around the Baltic Sea will be members of NATO for a very large part of the Baltic Sea, and of course the geographical situation of both Finland and Sweden will make it easier to protect the Baltic states if something happens. But of course, as members of NATO, we want to contribute to the security of all NATO countries.
Prime Minister, again, we all know that there was a last-minute obstacle. Apparently, at the very beginning, you had all canvassed all the NATO members, including Turkey, and that there was no initial objection. Then Turkey raised obstacles, and now, after many hours of discussion in Madrid, they lifted their veto, so to speak. Some are asking, even in your own country, whether Sweden and Finland, but mostly Sweden, caved in to Turkish demands. For instance, by refusing to support the YPG, which is the Syrian Kurdish group that has helped the West, particularly the US, fight ISIS in Syria.
I wouldn't agree with that description of the agreement that we were finally able to agree on yesterday after many hours of difficult discussions. The support to PYD is set in a context of the Turkish national security. So that would mean that we shouldn't support them with financial means or military support, and this is not something that Sweden is doing today, so it wouldn't change the course of action we're having today.
What else did Turkey ask that you and Finland agreed to? For instance, there's controversy over a demand for extradition. That always is very difficult for people in the West to accept, because who knows? I mean, we understand some journalists were on the extradition list. Have you pledged to allow extradition to Turkey?
I mean, we have agreed, this agreement has, I think, three dimensions. One dimension is the fact that we are right now doing several things in both Finland and Sweden to counter terrorism. For instance, we will go forward with a much stricter legislation on terrorism that will actually come into reality the 1st of July this year. That's one part. The other part are things that will come as we become members of NATO. Things will change for Sweden, for instance, on how we would see our legislation when it comes to arms export. And then the third thing is a closer cooperation between Sweden, Finland and Turkey when it comes to fight terrorism, and particularly with PKK. And one part of this is the fact that Turkey has earlier asked for extraditions, but just as before, we in Sweden will of course follow Swedish legislation and international conventions when it comes to extraditions. And of course, this is a concern among some Swedish citizens, but I've stated very clear today for those that are concerned. The first thing is we never extradite anyone who is a Swedish citizen. Number two, we will continue to follow Swedish and international legislation. So if you are not involved in terrorist activities, there is no need to worry.
So what would you say then to this independent Swedish politician? Her name is Amineh Kakabaveh, as you know pretty well. She's told a newspaper, quote, "It's unbelievable that Sweden is so scared of Putin that it would abandon everything it stands for another dictator, Erdogan."
I know that Amineh Kakabaveh is critical towards the Swedish NATO application, and I have respect for that view. But of course, Sweden will continue to stand up for our values, and we will also be a strong voice globally when it comes to democracy, rule of law, and an international-based world order.
So, Prime Minister, tell us a little bit what it was like in the room and how difficult it was to get Turkey to lift its veto. Because, you know, a lot of the color that's being written about it says that it was really going nowhere for the first couple of hours. Then there was a coffee break, and then somehow the negotiations unblocked. Can you give us a little bit more about the atmospherics around these negotiations?
I think we were all keen to solve this issue, and when you have 3 or 4 parties in a room and you want to solve a problem, most of the times you are able to solve a problem, and that was the case also yesterday. So I'm very happy that we could reach an agreement. I mean, there's no secret that Sweden and Finland and other NATO and EU countries do come from a different viewpoint when it comes to certain areas that we discuss with Turkey. And we were in the discussions very clear on Swedish stance in the fight against terrorism, our stance on PKK, and how we are improving our legislation when it comes to terrorism, but also financing of terrorism. And I think that was also important.
Prime Minister, the real threat, of course, as you've all identified, is from Russia and Putin, not just to Ukraine, but to the West and to the rest of the world. And so I just wonder how you think Putin will react to you and Finland acceding to NATO, becoming members, and in the interim, the so-called grey zone before you're full members. Have you been given absolute ironclad guarantees that you too will be defended and every square inch of your territory will be defended if there's a threat from Russia?
Yes, I think that's important to always remember. The reason why Sweden and Finland have decided to apply for NATO membership is the Russian invasion of Ukraine and its clear threat to the European security order. So far, the Russian reaction has been rather mild, and I think that makes a lot of sense, actually, since both Sweden and Finland, I mean, we have been members of the European Union for decades, and we have also been working closer and closer to NATO during the last years. And we have participated in most NATO operations globally. So from that perspective, it's not such a big step. And I think maybe that's what Russia is also seeing. When it comes to this grey period from the application until we are full members, of course, an important step is what we now will reach, the invitee status. But we have also spoken with many of the NATO member states and got security assurances from them. Among the countries, the United States, United Kingdom, France, Germany, or Spain, where we are today. And of course, the combination of those assurances and an invitee status, I think, makes Sweden in a more secure position than we were before we sent in the application.
Mm-hmm. Prime Minister, the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has warned against Ukraine fatigue, so-called, and he's talked about how the support for Ukraine must be maintained until they are able to get their territory back. This is what the NATO Secretary General said today in terms of what support will go to Ukraine. Let me just play this for you.
Ukraine can count on us for as long as it takes. Allies will continue to provide major military and financial help, and today leaders agreed to strengthen our support by agreeing a comprehensive assistance package for Ukraine.
Prime Minister, are you concerned that there is or will develop Ukraine fatigue? And are you concerned that there are splits beginning to show in terms of the United States, we understand, internally, is wondering whether Ukraine actually can win, no matter how many weapons are sent, and can regain its territory? What do you say about that?
I'm definitely concerned about potential Ukraine fatigue. And therefore, I think it's so important that we who are leaders of our country, that we also take the time to explain to our citizens that Ukraine is not only fighting a war for Ukraine, but also for democracy's right to choose their own destiny and live in peace and freedom. And I know that the whole world is now affected by this war, but that is because Russia has decided to invade a peaceful and friendly neighbor. And therefore, this war has to stop, and Ukraine has to win the war. So we must continue to act united. We have to continue with the sanctions, and we have to continue to support Ukraine humanitarianly, financially, and not the least with military support. We have to keep on sending weapons to Ukraine so they can defend their country in the way that they are legally allowed to do.
So what you're saying leads me to ask, then don't you believe that this is all a case for escalating aid to Ukraine, not just maintaining it, but escalating particularly military aid, as you see what the Russians are doing, particularly in the east right now?
Yes, I think we need to send more weapons to Ukraine so that they can defend themselves, yes. And we in Sweden, we are working on the next package for military support to Ukraine.
Can I just quickly switch a little bit to, presumably you've all been having discussions with your other counterparts, including President Biden. I just wanted to ask you, you know, Sweden has for a long time had a certain feminist foreign policy. You know what's happened in the United States, the reversal of women's rights in the United States for the first time ever in the Roe versus Wade Supreme Court decision. And you can see the hearings and what they're saying about President Trump's attempt to reverse democracy writ large. What kind of things have you been saying to President Biden as you all talk about trying to maintain democracy in the world against Putin?
Well, I mean, what is happening when it comes to women's rights in the United States is, of course, something that is worrying me and so many other women and men across the world. We in Sweden, we have had a feminist policy, a feminist government for many years now. And of course, we stand up for women's rights all over the world. I'm so worried that the decision in the United States will make so many women suffer, both for their lives and for their health, because this is what we see in countries where abortions aren't legal.
Prime Minister Andersson, thank you so much. Prime Minister Magdalena Andersson of Sweden.
Thank you.
I also spoke to the host of this historic NATO summit, the Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez. From Madrid, he told me this is about nothing less than defending our whole way of life. Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez, welcome to our program.
Thank you very much. Happy to be with you.
On such an important day, this is a very consequential, in all of your words, NATO summit. Perhaps the most consequential since the beginning of this alliance. Tell me in what regard you think that's true.
Well, I think it's true, first of all, because of the historical context that we are hosting this very important summit. Second, because we are about to approve the strategic concept, which is how the NATO will work in the next decade for the future. And third, because we are enlarging the NATO alliance to very important democratic European countries such as Finland and Sweden. And of course, because at the end of the day, what we're doing is sending a message of unity against Putin in solidarity with Ukraine. So at the end of the day, what we are doing is gathering, hosting a very important summit of democracies that defends our common values, which are democracy, freedom, and a rule-based international order.
In other words, Prime Minister, everything is on the line. And I just want to mention the Finland and the Sweden situation. What would have happened if you could not have gotten some kind of agreement for Turkey to lift its veto? What message would Putin have taken away?
Well, I think that sooner or later, it was going to happen. So we're very glad that we reached this agreement in Madrid. I think it's important. If we go back to the 90s, 97, the alliance, NATO, was comprised by 16 members. 11 of those were Europeans, were belonging to the European Union. Nowadays, we have an alliance of 30 countries. So before this agreement, yesterday evening, we were 21 countries coming from the European Union, and after this agreement, we will be 23 out of 30 member states of the alliance coming from the European Union. So I do believe that this agreement and this summit also, I would say, will highlight the Europeanization of NATO, which is, by the way, undermined by the war in Ukraine by Putin.
We're going to talk about Ukraine specifically in a moment, but first I want to ask you about Putin's threats and capabilities beyond Ukraine. I want to first play you a little soundbite from what the U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said a couple of months ago about America's intent for how this should all end up. This is what he said.
We want to see Russia weakened to the degree that it can't do the kinds of things that it has done in invading Ukraine. So it has already lost a lot of military capability and a lot of its troops, quite frankly. And we want to see them not have the capability to very quickly reproduce that capability.
So, Mr. Prime Minister, the idea was to weaken Russia so it couldn't do what it's doing in Ukraine. Do you believe now, more than 100 days, in the 5th month now of this war, that Russia has been weakened? Because all we see is it consolidating its grip on the east and the south of Ukraine.
Well, actually, I think that Putin has reviewed his military strategy since the beginning of the war. But I do believe that perhaps we are facing a longer conflict than we expected in the beginning. That is why I think it was so important, the G7 summit last week in Germany, and now the Madrid summit, because we are sending a clear message to Putin, which is we are going to support Ukraine, and of course we're ready, to support Ukraine until the Russian troops leave the country and they respect the territorial integrity and the national sovereignty of Ukraine. So I think it's important to send this message of unity and determination of the international community, especially the NATO allies, and of course the G7, in order to make possible to return to a scenario where different countries, especially Russia in this case, respect a rule-based international order, which is undermined because of this terrible war in Ukraine.
Can I ask you specifically, because there have been now a lot of reporting about, yes, the international community, NATO is making a huge effort to bolster Ukraine's defenses and obviously sending weapons. But no, some of the governments who've promised to send them have not done so. Germany has been very slow. France has been slow. There are questions about what Spain has actually sent in terms of what actually needs what the Ukrainians need now in the east, the long-range artillery, the kind of stuff to ward off the Putin doctrine of attrition, which is what you're seeing in the east. Tell me what you have sent, and are you convinced that your counterparts have no Ukraine fatigue and will keep this up?
Well, so far what I heard from all the allies in the summit is our commitment to send military capabilities to the Ukraine. So far in Spain, what we have done is to send 400 tons of military capacities and, of course, humanitarian aid to Ukraine. And, within the European Union framework, we are financing this European peace facility, which is used by the European Union institutions in order to provide military capacities to Ukraine. So we are ready, and we are standby with the Ukrainian army forces and, of course, the government to help them to repeal this invasion.
Mr. Prime Minister, you remember very well, because you mentioned it today, that in 2010, when the last major strategic concept of NATO, was established in Lisbon. At that time, President Medvedev of Russia was invited. Russia was considered, quote, a strategic partner. Now, NATO is saying, you're all saying that it's the major strategic threat to Europe and to this part of the world and its values. Just, if you had to do it all over again, was it a mistake, even in 2010, to consider Russia a strategic partner, given what it had already done in Georgia, Moldova, etc., and what Putin was already saying about the West and NATO?
Well, I think that at that time we tried to give Russia an opportunity, and to Putin especially an opportunity, and perhaps over the years we've been a bit naive in our relations with Russia, because nowadays what we are seeing is an expansionist and imperialist behavior by Putin and his regime, and this is something unacceptable. At the end of the day, we're not speaking only about a European security matter. If you speak with African leaders, with leaders from Latin America and all over the world, they will tell you that this is a global challenge, this is a global threat for the international order, and this is something that we need to keep in mind. So at the end of the day, what we are doing in Europe is to defend our values, our democracies. The entrance of Finland and Sweden in NATO is not because they want to expand their territories, but to defend their values, their democracies, and of course an international order based on rules, clear rules that provide certainty and security to our societies, which is at the end of the day the basic rule in order to provide prosperity and well-being to our societies. So I think that this is a global threat, not a European threat only. And secondly, perhaps, we've been a bit naive after Crimea, after other movements that Putin put in place over the last decade. So I think it's important what we are now approving in this Madrid summit, which is to define Russia as a strategic threat for the allies, and define what are the means, the instruments that we are going to put in place in order to respond to this global threat.
So just to expand on that, you're talking about preserving democracy, which affects all of us, obviously. And you've been having one-on-one and other talks with President Joe Biden. You've obviously been watching a certain amount or hearing the hearings about January 6th, the insurrection, the very deadly and bloody insurrection against American democracy. What have you been discussing about that? And what is your reaction to, for instance, what just came out about what Donald Trump was doing on that day?
Well, I think, after what we knew with this resolution of the Supreme Court in the U.S., with this majority of conservatives in the Supreme Court regarding abortion, I was born in 1972. So the law and the recognition for the abortion of women in the U.S. was passed, the law, in 1973. So also this lesson means how difficult it is to advance in these civil rights for women and for other groups of our societies, and how easy it is backlash as we are now witnessing with these very controversial decisions. And of course, I participated some months ago in a forum that President Biden organized with other democracies in order to see how can we show our societies that democracy is the best system ever to, in a effective manner, we can solve the challenges that our societies have. Inequality, of course, is certainly the biggest challenge that we face, but of course we have others: security, climate change, and so on and so forth. So I think that now our democracies are, under this pressure from our societies to respond effectively to these challenges and to, reinforce our international order based in this rule-based and certainty that we need in order to provide economic growth and prosperity to our societies.
Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.
For his part, President Biden announced at the NATO summit today that the United States would beef up its military presence in Europe, establishing a permanent army headquarters in Poland, sending 3,000 more troops to Romania, and increasing troop deployments in the Baltic states, bolstering U.S. commitment to democracy abroad, while at home, as we've discussed, explosive testimony from a Trump White House aide is sending shockwaves through that country. Speaking before the January 6th committee, Cassidy Hutchinson revealed extraordinary new details about President Trump's conduct that awful day. Correspondent Ryan Nobles has this report.
From the moment she was sworn in,
you swear or affirm.
Cassidy Hutchinson, former aide to Trump White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, made it clear she had much to share.
That evening was the first moment that I remember feeling scared and nervous for what could happen on January 6th.
Providing unique insight into a chaotic White House in the days leading up to January 6th, and a president who cheered on the rioters, and she says she was told, desperately wanted to be with them.
The president said something to the effect of, "I'm the effing president, take me up to the Capitol now." The president reached up towards the front of the vehicle to grab at the steering wheel. Mr. Engel grabbed his arm, said, "Sir, you need to take your hand off the steering wheel. We're going back to the West Wing. We're not going to the Capitol." Mr. Trump then used his free hand to lunge towards Bobby Engel.
Hutchinson detailed Trump's insistence that he follow his supporters to the Capitol on January 6th, despite being told repeatedly it was dangerous and potentially illegal.
Mr. Cipollone said something to the effect of, "Please make sure we don't go up to the Capitol, Cassidy. Keep in touch with me. We're going to get charged with every crime imaginable if we make that movement happen." We had conversations about potentially obstructing justice or defrauding the electoral count.
She outlined repeated examples of an unstable commander-in-chief who lashed out in anger often after losing the 2020 election, like when he learned Attorney General William Barr told the Associated Press there was no widespread voter fraud.
There was ketchup dripping down the wall, and there's a shattered porcelain plate on the floor. The valet had articulated that the president was extremely angry at the Attorney General's AP interview and had thrown his lunch against the wall.
Sitting just doors away from the Oval Office, Hutchinson was central to key moments leading up to January 6th. Meadows himself warned her.
Things might get real bad on January 6th.
She also made it clear White House officials knew about the vast array of weapons the crowd was carrying.
I got 3 men walking down the street in fatigue carrying AR-15, copy at 14th and Independence.
Including Trump, who said in a tent at the rally site,
I overheard the president say something to the effect of, I don't effing care that they have weapons. They're not here to hurt me. Take the effing mags away. Let my people in. They can march to the Capitol from here. Let the people in. Take the effing mags away.
We're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down to the Capitol.
Hutchinson said she was also in contact with Republican leaders, like House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, who warned her that Trump should not come to the Capitol.
And he said, well, he just said it on stage, Cassidy. Figure it out. Don't come up here.
As the crowd was raging, Hutchinson testified that Trump was cheering them on, agreeing with the chance to, quote, hang Mike Pence.
And Mark had responded something to the effect of, you heard him, Pat. He thinks Mike deserves it. He doesn't think they're doing anything wrong.
And recounted White House counsel Pat Cipollone's reaction.
People are going to die and the blood's going to be on your effing hands.
The day after the violence, the White House counsel and advisors urged him to give a speech condemning the rioters.
We need to get a stronger message out there and condemn this, otherwise this will be your legacy. There's already talks about invoking the 25th Amendment. You need this as cover.
Trump wanted to float the idea of pardons for those who broke into the Capitol, something he ultimately did not do.
Mr. Meadows did seek that pardon.
And according to Hutchinson, many others, including Meadows and Giuliani, sought pardons from Trump. A once loyal Republican committed to Trump and his mission, Hutchinson now says,
I remember feeling frustrated, disappointed, and really, it felt personal. I was really sad. As an American, I was disgusted. It was unpatriotic. It was un-American. We were watching the Capitol building get defaced over a lie.
And the Secret Service is refuting aspects of Hutchinson's testimony. They say that incident that she talked about involving the former president inside the presidential limo on January 6th is not exactly how she portrays it. They say their agents are willing to testify under oath to the committee about their experience. They say it didn't happen that way, and they also say they never told Hutchinson that story. Meanwhile, the committee is standing by their witness. A source close to the committee tells me on background that she was willing to stand up and testify under oath, but they're also willing to hear from anyone who has information that would help with their investigation.
Ryan Noble's reporting those shocking details. Our next guest has advised the January 6th committee with his expertise on authoritarianism. He's the author of How Fascism Works, Jason Stanley, and he joins Hari Srinivasan to analyze the hearings and the state of American democracy.
Christiane, thanks. Jason Stanley, thanks so much for joining us. First, let's talk a little bit about the hearings yesterday. What struck you about them?
Well, what struck me about them is they confirmed what many have suspected, including myself, that Trump was not, if the testimony is accurate, that Trump was not a passive actor in the events of January 6th, but was deeply emotionally involved and wanted to be there on the scene and was perhaps conflicted, but certainly was not removing himself from the actual active move towards the Capitol.
You know, for our audience, we should point out that at some levels you have advised the committee, and I don't know what you can share publicly about that, but is this going according to any conversations that you might have been party to?
Well, I think for me, in my case, they asked me about coups and authoritarianism and fascism and the structure of the rolling coup that we're seeing. Which is not an aspect that they've particularly covered. I think we have covered it in the sense that we've seen that everyone in Washington knew that the election was fair. Everyone in Washington, all the people who surrounded the president, knew that he was lying, and many of them went along anyway. And so that, to me, is the aspect that needs the most attention for Americans, that so many of our leading politicians knew exactly that this was a lie and went ahead with this attempt to overthrow U.S. democracy.
What about the levels of accountability, or I guess in this case, lack thereof? I mean, for the committee to kind of present people one after the other that did the right thing, partly because there was a concern that the rule of law would catch up to them. But we really haven't seen it catch up to anybody yet.
Absolutely, and that's why the coup is, as it were, ongoing. Because it's abundantly clear that everyone surrounding the president felt that they were in legal jeopardy. They were in severe legal jeopardy. And that is what held them back from going ahead. We know that state by state, from state legislatures such as Michigan to Trump's inner circle, they saw clearly and obviously that this was an illegal attempt to overthrow the United States of America, and were blocked from going forward. I wish, as a philosopher, that Socrates was right that justice could be its own reward. But Socrates' interlocutors claim people are only just because they're punished for it if they're not. And what we've seen is that the fear of punishment is what kept American democracy alive. And now that everyone has seen that there is no accountability, that there are no consequences, that means that the next time, what's to stop the coup from succeeding?
Yeah, I also wonder about the violence, not just the day of, but the idea that there were so many people that knew that this had a very high probability of getting out of hand, and yet continued. We're talking multiple emails and texts going back and forth where people were in consultation and they were actually scared of what could happen on January 6th.
I'm very glad you asked about that, Hari. That's one thing that I'm regularly asked about in this context, in my expertise as a philosopher of language, and in particular in my role as an expert and scholar on rhetoric that encourages and justifies violence. What we've seen, as I've talked about on the show before, is explicit calls for violence and revenge, a narrative that lays out a justification for political violence. Any expert on political violence would tell you that this kind of talk is exactly the kind of talk that justifies political violence. You're saying, take back our country, you've been betrayed, this is a revolution. All of this kind of vocabulary, the setting up is setting up mass political violence. Then you have this new revelation from yesterday that I really focused on about weapons, that the president said, okay, they should be allowed in with their weapons, according to the witness. Think about that in the context of the recent Supreme Court decision, allowing arms to be carried, allowing arms to be carried everywhere, essentially. So this idea that we're going to have a mass prevalence of weapons in the run-up to an election that, by all indicators, looks like it will involve political violence. And then the president saying they should be allowed to bring weapons. So I'm very concerned about this kind of normalization of political violence, this kind of, this is the American way to carry guns, to have a militia. The Supreme Court is saying, no, the correct reading of the Second Amendment is, be armed to defend yourself against what? Against what? Well, the president really, that testimony yesterday seemed to suggest that the president was building a narrative that revenge for a supposedly stolen election could involve things in the Constitution that allow us to bear arms. And that kind of gelling of the narrative between the Supreme Court's decision and yesterday's testimony concerns me deeply.
Yeah, that you mentioned the Supreme Court, I want to talk a little bit about that. I mean, the cases in the last couple of weeks have indicated a court that's kind of finding that it has the power and is willing to use it. It has also shaken, for a lot of people, the legitimacy of the court. I mean, public opinion numbers are down in the 20s. And I wonder what that does to a functioning democracy if we lose one branch of government, or at least perceive it as similar to the others, partisan.
Well, a one-party state needs to seize the courts. And this court is clearly a Republican court. This kind of started with Bush v. Gore in 20 years ago or so. But this court is very clearly a partisan court. I think it's kind of owning the libs is not actually in the Constitution. And so these rulings on Roe versus Wade, on hints about undermining other rights, and fulfilling a sort of kind of nakedly partisan agenda. The ruling, I believe yesterday, about the gerrymandering in Louisiana, that very severe Republican racial gerrymander was constitutional. These certainly seem to check off, they check off Republican dream points on the platform. And you have to ask yourself, is it really the case that the founders wrote the Constitution expecting to legitimate every kind of Republican wish list in recent years? I think that's probably constitutionally dubious. I think it's probably doubtful that the founders had access to the Republican Party platforms in the 21st century. So it's extremely worrisome. We had a president voted in by a minority of the population, appoint 3 radical right Supreme Court justices to join already some radical right Supreme Court justices, and they're fulfilling sort of point by point a Republican Party platform, to the point where Congresswoman Bobart said, the founders intended the church to guide the government. The Constitution is becoming a kind of part of this mythic past, this invented mythic past that justifies everything the Republicans, that the Republicans are just inventing, justifies their political priorities. And that's something that obviously is characteristic of a one-party state. And that's where we're tilting, at the very least, into a one-party state where that party is supported only by a minority of the population. If you look at the poll numbers, the majority of Americans are not for overturning Roe versus Wade.
I want us to talk about the role of fear, because one of the things that came up in the testimony recently in these hearings is that the committee asks witnesses, has anybody basically tried to intimidate you? And they get a series of responses that almost read like a script from some sort of a mob movie. Hey, you going to be a team player? I'm going to remember you, the day before their testimony. How is it that either the president or his supporters still have this much power and sway being out of office?
This is a long theme in the literature on authoritarianism and fascism. People always make a comparison between the fascist leader and a mob boss. In a rule of law state, everyone is equal, everyone is subject to law equally. In a fascist state, or maybe even an authoritarian state of whatever kind of stripe, it's all about loyalty to the leader. And loyalty to the party. It's loyalty rather than rule of law. So that's how you have to think about it. So there's a lot of literature, say in the Frankfurt School, about theorizing about the relationship between the mafia boss, the mob boss, and the leader of a one-party authoritarian state, a Stalin or a Hitler, because it's loyalty to the leader that replaces the rule of law. And this is just classic what we're seeing. We're seeing loyalty to the leader. And the way it works is like, if we're headed towards a one-party state in this country, let's be clear about what's happening. If it's not led by Trump, it will be led by someone else, because what we've seen shows a bunch of people what is possible. And there's no accountability. So that is where we're headed unless Americans wake up and we all do something about it together. And the way that works is, the people who show loyalty will be protected. The institutions that show loyalty will be protected, and everyone else will be smashed. This is really central in the literature on authoritarianism.
So what should happen to the people that supported the president? Obviously, there are trials happening for the people who actually walked into the Capitol right now, and they are facing consequences. But relatively speaking, they're small fries in this all. The people who had the ability to stop this before it started, or even after it started, the ones who were advising the president in ways that were anti-democratic? What should happen to them? And if nothing happens to them, then what?
I'm really against the idea that only the small fry get punished. I mean, I think they are, to some extent, victims as well here of their leaders. The fact is that when the leaders of a country say that people should go on the streets and overthrow that country because they've been betrayed, then many people will believe them. And so I think that the United States has been betrayed by political leaders. Some accountability must occur. If it doesn't occur, then you will see what we see right now, which is in state after state elections, the election apparatus being taken over by people who know that it was a complete lie that the election was stolen and think, well, America should be run just by our team. And American democracy, that's what the enemy is. So there must be accountability. There is a large portion of today's Republican Party that has proven itself to be against democracy. What the January 6th Commission did that was so important for our democracy is they showed that Senator Hawley, Senator Cruz, and the other senators who went along with this knew it was a lie. So they were part of a conspiracy to overthrow American democracy, and they should not be allowed to be political leaders. I think that, to me, is the kind of accountability I'd like to see. I don't think prisons need to be in the picture, but some accountability must happen. You cannot have a political party that is opposed to democracy.
That brings me to maybe my last question here. What is uniquely American that got us into this situation or prevented it from being worse? Are we capable of preventing something like this from happening, or is our structure built where this is bound to happen again?
Democracy is always fragile. Democracy is hard. This idea that we will perpetually be a democracy is a fiction. We're actually a new democracy. We only became a democracy once Black Americans were given the right to vote in the 1960s. So we were, and right now we're still a partial democracy. Democracies are fragile things by their very nature. A small sliver of humans throughout history have lived in democracies, though democracy is an ancient system of government. The reason we're powerful as a country, and the reason we're special, and the reason I'm so proud to be an American, is because democracy, the vocabulary of democracy, is interwoven with being an American. So unlike other countries that can sort of like, use democracy sort of like as a fig leaf, the vocabulary. Americans, democracy is something that is a rallying cry. It's something that the civil rights movement used. It's something that liberation movements in America have always been able to use. From Frederick Douglass on, they've been able to say, we are these ideals and we're not living up to them. And that gives us a unique kind of power. And that has always, in the past, helped us in fits and starts. We always go, but we often go back, but slowly move ahead, forward and then backward, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. We're seeing that again. Those of us who study democracy, those of us who study it philosophically, historically, understand that democracies are fragile because one group will always want to rise up and seize power and take it for themselves. And that's the natural state of things. So it's always hard. And we should recognize it's always hard, and preserving a democracy is and will always be a difficult thing to do.
Jason Stanley, thanks as always.
Thank you.
And as one who has covered plenty of minority authoritarian one-party countries around the world, that sobering warning from an expert on democracy in the United States and the threats therein is very, very important. And finally tonight, an update on a beautiful beach with an ugly past and a happy-ish ending. In a historic vote, the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors has unanimously agreed to return Bruce's Beach to the descendants of the original Black owners, Willa and Charles Bruce. The prime piece of real estate was taken away from them nearly 100 years ago under the under the guise of eminent domain. That is, government seizure for public use, though really, it was taken away because they were black. County officials will now rent the land from the Bruce family for $413,000 a year, with the option of buying the property, which is worth some $20 million right now, sometime down the line. Descendant Anthony Bruce called the vote bittersweet, and he hopes similar cases will follow, telling the New York Times, "Let this be the drop that creates the ripple, that creates the wave, that creates the tsunami that covers the country." And that is it.